You felt ashamed of something today. Maybe it was small, a moment you replayed where you said the wrong thing or didn't say the right thing or did something you told yourself you wouldn't do. Maybe it was older than today, something that surfaces without warning, that arrives when you're in the shower or trying to fall asleep. Shame is specific, it's different from guilt, even though we use the words interchangeably. Guilt says I did something bad. Shame says I am something bad. Guilt is about an act. Shame is about a self. And here's what's strange about that. Shame requires a self to evaluate. It requires the ability to see yourself as others might see you, to step outside your own perspective and view yourself from the outside, as a social object, as a person being judged. That cognitive ability is extraordinarily rare in nature, and it arrived in the human species at a specific moment in our evolutionary history, a moment we can trace. Shame is one of the most studied and least understood emotions in psychology. The distinction between shame and guilt was systematically described by psychologist June Tangney, whose decades of research established that they are not the same emotion and do not produce the same effects. Guilt, Tangney found, motivates repair. When you feel guilty about something, the most common behavioral response is to want to fix it, to apologize, to make amends, to change the behavior. Guilt is uncomfortable, but it is productive. It points outward toward the act. Shame does something different. Shame points inward toward the self, and the most common behavioral response is withdrawal, hiding, denial, avoidance. In extreme cases, aggression, turning the shame outward onto others to escape it. Shame says the problem is not what I did, the problem is what I am. This distinction matters for the evolutionary story, because an emotion that motivates repair, guilt, has a clear social function. It keeps you in good standing with others by motivating you to fix what you broke. But an emotion that motivates hiding has a more complicated relationship with social function. Hiding from shame doesn't repair anything, it conceals. Why would evolution produce an emotion that makes you want to conceal yourself from the social group you depend on for survival? The answer is that shame is not primarily about concealment. It is primarily about calibration. It is the emotional system that tracks the gap between how you present yourself and how you actually are, and generates a response strong enough to motivate change. Shame hurts more than guilt because it targets something more fundamental. It targets the self. And the self, the social identity you maintain in the eyes of others, is, in evolutionary terms, one of your most important assets. Reputation is survival. Shame is the alarm that tells you your reputation is at risk. If shame were a cultural invention, a product of specific moral or religious frameworks, you would expect to find significant variation across cultures. Societies with different values would shame different things. The experience itself would vary. What researchers actually find is more complicated. The triggers of shame vary enormously. What generates shame in one culture may generate pride in another. The specific content is culturally determined. But the experience of shame, the felt quality of it, the hiding impulse, the sense that a fundamental self has been exposed and found wanting, appears to be universal. Paul Ekman, who studied emotional expression across cultures for decades, found that shame and its associated behaviors, gaze aversion, postural collapse, face touching, withdrawal, were recognized across cultures with no exposure to Western behavioral norms. The face of shame, the body of shame, the behavioral response to shame, these are consistent across societies in ways that suggest something deeper than cultural learning. And the developmental timeline of shame is revealing. Children show the first signs of self-conscious emotions, shame, pride, embarrassment, around 18 months to 2 years. This is precisely the developmental window when self-recognition emerges, when children first recognize themselves in mirrors, when the concept of a self that can be observed from outside begins to form. You cannot feel shame without a self to feel ashamed of. The two develop simultaneously. In the animal kingdom, self-recognition is extraordinarily rare. Chimpanzees, gorillas, and orangutans pass the mirror test. Dolphins and elephants show evidence of it. Most species, including most primates, do not. And without self-recognition, without the ability to model how you appear to others, shame is not possible. The animals that feel something like shame are the same animals that recognize themselves. And the most sophisticated shame response on Earth is in the animal with the most developed theory of self. You, the species that can see itself most clearly from the outside, is also the species that feels most acutely the gap between how it wants to appear and how it actually is. Here is why shame evolved, as best as evolutionary psychology can currently determine. Human beings are intensely social animals who live in groups where reputation is a critical resource. Your reputation determines whether you receive cooperation, support, and resources from other group members. A good reputation attracts allies. A bad reputation, a reputation as a cheater, a free rider, someone who takes without reciprocating, triggers exclusion. Social exclusion in prehistoric conditions was not just uncomfortable, it was dangerous. Exile from the group in an environment where survival required cooperation was frequently fatal. Shame is the emotional system that monitors reputational risk. It fires when you have violated, or when you believe you have violated, the social expectations that maintain your standing in the group. The hiding response that shame produces, the desire to conceal, to withdraw, to make yourself invisible, makes sense in this context. If your behavior has damaged your reputation, concealment limits further damage. Withdrawal removes you from the social arena, where further negative evaluation can occur. This is not adaptive in the long term. In the long term, shame needs to motivate change, not just concealment. And Tangney's research suggests that shame without repair, shame that collapses inward without producing behavior change, is associated with depression, anxiety, and paradoxically, increased likelihood of the behaviors that triggered shame in the first place. But the immediate impulse makes sense. When you've been caught out, when the gap between your presented self and your actual self has been exposed, your first evolutionary instinct is to minimize further exposure. What distinguishes adaptive shame from toxic shame is what happens next, whether the shame motivates genuine change or whether it collapses into concealment and self-attack. And here's the piece that connects to your life today. The shame you feel about small things, the cringe at a memory, the heat in your face when you remember something you did 10 years ago is the same system that once functioned to protect your standing in the group. It fires whether or not the group is watching. It fires at memories. It fires at hypotheticals. It was built for a world where reputation was tracked in real time by people who knew you. It runs in a world that looks very different. The neuroscience of shame is one of the most active areas in social neuroscience, partly because understanding shame is critical to understanding a wide range of psychological conditions in which it plays a central role. The key brain regions involved in shame form a network that is fundamentally social. The medial prefrontal cortex, the region most associated with self-referential thought, with thinking about yourself, is central. So is the posterior superior temporal sulcus, which is involved in interpreting social signals and modeling other minds, and the anterior insula, which generates the visceral discomfort that gives shame its physical quality. Shame is neurologically a social cognition experience that generates a visceral physical response. It requires modeling how you appear to others, mentalizing, registering that this appearance is negative evaluation, and producing a physical signal of that evaluation, insula activation. This is a complex, expensive neural operation. It requires significant cognitive infrastructure. It is not reflexive in the way fear is reflexive. It requires the full machinery of social cognition running at high load, which means it is relatively recent, evolutionarily speaking. The cognitive prerequisites for shame, self-recognition, theory of mind, the ability to model how you appear to others are uniquely or near-uniquely human capacities. Whatever their precursors in other primates, shame in its full human form requires a degree of social cognition that emerged late in the evolutionary timeline. The estimate from behavioral evidence and comparative psychology is that something like shame, a self-conscious social emotion that registers reputational threat, emerged in the Homo sapiens lineage somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago. The same general window as other complex social emotions. There is also a distinction in the neuroscience between chronic shame, shame that becomes a trait, a persistent sense of being fundamentally defective, and situational shame, which is a response to a specific event. Chronic shame shows a different neural signature. It involves sustained activation of the default mode network in a self-critical, ruminative pattern. It is associated with depression, social anxiety, and paradoxically, reduced moral behavior because people overwhelmed by shame stop thinking clearly about the repair. The same emotion that evolved to protect your reputation can, in its chronic form, disable the very social functioning it was designed to protect. The distinction between shame and guilt is well established in research, but some researchers argue it is less categorical than Tangney's work suggests. In lived experience, the emotions often co-occur and blur. The evolutionary account of shame as reputational monitoring is compelling but speculative. We cannot directly observe the social conditions of prehistoric human groups or establish definitively that shame's function was reputational rather than something else. The neuroscience of shame is advancing rapidly, but the field is young. Many studies have small samples, and the brain regions involved in shame overlap with regions involved in other social and self-referential processes. The specific neural signature of shame as distinct from related emotions is still being mapped. What is well established is that shame is a self-conscious emotion requiring self-recognition, that it produces specific behavioral responses including withdrawal and concealment, that it appears universally across cultures in its felt quality, and that it activates social cognition networks in the brain. The mechanism is complex, the reality is not in doubt. So when did ancient humans first start feeling shame? When they first developed the ability to see themselves from the outside, when self-recognition emerged, when the capacity to model how you appear to another mind became sophisticated enough to generate a specific emotional response to the gap between appearance and reality. Somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 years ago, a human being felt, for perhaps the first time, not just that they had done something wrong, but that they were at risk of being seen as something wrong. That feeling, that specific, shrinking, heat-in-the-face, please don't look at me feeling, is one of the most sophisticated emotional productions of the human nervous system. It requires knowing you have a self. It requires knowing that self is visible to others. It requires caring how that self appears. The next time shame arrives, the next time you feel that specific desire to be smaller than you are, recognize it for what it is. One question. Is there something you've been ashamed of for years that you've now, after this video, reconsidered? Or does understanding where shame comes from make it harder to dismiss it? Drop it in the comments. This has been one of the most personal series on this channel. I want to know where you land. If this changed something, like button. And if you're in for the rest of the origin stories, subscribe. We are far from done. See you soon.